call the meeting to order. And so we can get Mayor Benoit hooked in here. So I'll call to order the November 16, 2018 Stationary Source Committee meeting here in CC8 in our remote locations. Dr. Parker, would you like to join us for this meeting? Yeah. Or are you running out?
Sorry. Only if you need me.
No, we don't need you for a quorum, so that's okay. You can go do whatever you need to do.
Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. Let's see. I guess I need to pay attention to what's on the agenda then. Item number 1 is update on source testing efforts for proposed, well, what may have been or may never be proposed rule 1407.1, emissions of toxic air contaminants from chromium alloy melting operations. So, Michael, we got you.
Good morning, Dr. Building Committee members. I'll be providing a brief presentation on what might be proposed rule 1407.1. As you recall, during the last governing board meeting, we did ask to continue the meeting after we received a late proposal from industry asking that we allow the source testing to be done by 3 volunteer facilities rather than proceed with the rule. We said that we'd come back at this stationary source committee meeting with details on what's gone on. So to give you the details on, over the last 2 weeks, we sent our source testing team out to the facilities that have volunteered to make sure that the sites were viable. We've been working through the various issues that needed to be resolved in order to do the testing. And at this point, I'm happy to say that we've pretty much resolved those issues. Some areas where we did come to agreement with the facilities, they wanted to remain anonymous, and we're fine with that aspect of it. They wanted to have a third party be part of the testing, whether it be doing the testing or as an observer, and so we're working that into our RFP as well. We're ideally hoping to do the testing over the next few months, completing sometime in February. The facilities that will be participating well represent the types of facilities that would be subject to the proposed rule if it goes forward. These are facilities that have electric induction furnaces with larger capacities doing chromium alloys. And so staff is recommending that we finalize basically our efforts to put out this RFP, give that to the source testing companies that might be doing the testing or participating as a third party, and not going forward with the rule or the source testing at Cal Poly Pomona. And with that, that concludes my presentation.
Before we go to board member questions, comments, do we have any members of the public who wish to address us today on this item? One? Okay, no. Any in the remote locations? All right. Any comments from the board?
No, I'm happy to hear that there's been compromise.
Yes,
I want to thank the staff. I want to thank the staff for working with everybody.
Are they going to be testing only for hexavalent chromium? Will they be testing for nickel and other metals too?
They will be testing for hexavalent chromium, arsenic, cadmium, and nickel.
Okay.
As well as PM.
Great, thank you. There's an information item, so we don't need to vote. And that'll bring us to item number 2. Thank you very much, Michael. Proposed amended Rule 1403, asbestos emissions from demolition and renovation activities. Sarah?
Great, thanks. Good morning, everybody. So yeah, I'm going to give a description of what we've been doing on proposed amended Rule 1403. It's a little background. So asbestos is bad stuff. It's been, EPA has identified it as a hazardous pollutant all the way back in 1971. EPA has established regulations to address and minimize exposures from asbestos fibers during renovation and demolition activities. That's their NESHAP. That rule has last been updated in 1990. We have our own version of the rule here, so that incorporates the minimum requirements of the NESHAP. But we also have additional requirements that we have in 1403 that we believe are necessary to protect folks from exposure. So we have areas where we are more stringent than the federal regulations. Our rule was last revised back in 2007. Real quick, just some of the health risks from asbestos. As I mentioned, it's pretty bad stuff. You breathe in these fibers, they embed in the lung. They can cause lung diseases such as asbestosis, mesothelioma, also lung cancer and other forms of cancer. A quick, few things to note is that symptoms often of these diseases often take place many years after exposure, so there's often not this immediate reaction. And there's no real safe threshold for asbestos exposure. But we do know in general, the more you are exposed, the greater your chances are of developing symptoms. But despite it being bad stuff, it's in a bunch of things that we use. And even though asbestos has been phased out a lot over the last few years, its use is not banned in the US. And the properties that cause us health risks, these long fibers that we breathe in and can embed in our lungs, also have properties that make them useful in insulation, as a fire retardant, and also in adding strength to different types of building materials. So we find it in a lot of common building materials, which is why we have regulations for activities involving renovation and demolition to try to minimize those exposures. So why are we doing this rule at this point? Again, I mentioned the last revision was back in 2007. We've, since that time, realized there's a number of requirements where folks were unsure how the rule would be implemented, so wanting to clarify existing rule requirements. We also had some areas where we needed to beef up the rule a little bit to enhance enforceability and make sure that we would be able to ensure those provisions are implemented. And then also align with federal requirements. And the key word here is where appropriate. I mentioned before 1403 is a more stringent regulation than the federal regulation, and we've deliberately done that. We've had fairly extensive public process on this rule. We've been meeting with a working group since May of this year. We've had 5 working group meetings since that time. We've issued multiple versions of draft rule language for stakeholders to provide inputs and give us reactions. We've also had independent meetings with different facilities and also meetings at our headquarters to again, get input and talk about concerns. And then in addition to that, have responded to multiple emails and phone calls and comments. So in terms of the changes that we have, first I want to talk about rule applicability. We had some confusion of exactly who was covered by the rule. Our existing language refers to owners and operators, but there had been some confusion by folks as lessors, for example, how they would be covered. And so we've clarified that definition to make it more comprehensive. One area where we're adding a class of individuals and making the rule applicable to them is for asbestos consultants. Asbestos consultants aren't necessarily owners or operators of these activities, but they are integrally involved in the whole demolition and renovation process, and they play an important role. So we've made the rule applicable to those folks for the provisions of the rule that they're responsible. On notification requirements, we have an electronic notification system for when folks have to notify us as to when they're doing asbestos work. We've been using that exclusively for several years at this point, and so we revised rule language to eliminate the provisions that pertain to written notification for asbestos work. We do have provisions for, it is an electronic system, so occasionally it will go down. So when the system's down, you can notify us by phone if it's down. And then we also have provisions if notifications happen during off hours, weekends, etc., where they can still notify, and the fact that our system is down is not a barrier. A lot of discussion with stakeholders on emergency notifications. So under the federal NESHAP, there's a 10-day notification period before starting asbestos work. That's a federal requirement, it's a minimum requirement, we can't go below that. However, it can be waived in the event of emergency. So then the question is what constitutes an emergency such that you can waive that notification period. A lot of this confusion and back and forth on that, and so we've clarified and beefed up that language to make it clear that when we're talking about emergencies, it's an imminent threat to public health and safety. So in that case, the waiving the notification period, which would allow our compliance staff to review the application and make sure everything is okay, that benefit is outweighed by this imminent threat to public health and safety and the need to address that particular situation. There was also a provision in the definition discussing a sudden event, that the emergency was a sudden event. We heard some feedback from stakeholders that sometimes they'll go into a situation and they'll see that there's an emergency, something's fallen down, it's causing a risk, but they don't know when it happened. And so is that really sudden? And so we've modified language to accommodate those kinds of concerns or situations. And then we've also added a certification requirement for these emergency notification letters. We've experienced some fairly widespread abuse of the emergency notifications in the past, where folks have been claiming emergencies and then they're not really them. And you know, again, we feel that there's a lot of value in having that 10-day notification period for compliance staff to be able to review the applications. So we've added the certification provision just as an additional step to make people think about and that this is an actual emergency. Many discussions about underground pipe. So cementatious pipe contains asbestos, and it's used in a lot of utility work, and a lot of questions about the buried cementatious pipe. Are there provisions that we could have to streamline asbestos work in those situations? And we had many discussions about the situation where the pipe's buried and it's in a remote location, and so the risk of exposure is relatively small in those instances. And these renovations or this work is routine, so we always have a good idea of how the procedures we need to put in place to address that work. So we're proposing new language that would allow a reduced notification period. It's a 2-day time frame to accommodate this kind of routine work. Again, limited to underground pipe and limited to areas where they're remote, so it's more than a quarter mile from nearest receptors. On sampling protocols, our current rule pointed to a provision of federal rule language that no longer exists. So we needed to make sure that we were clear as to what the minimum number of samples that needed to be taken to identify asbestos-containing materials and situations where you would need to take extra precautions to do asbestos work. And so we're now clarified that language to point to the federal regulation, the Asbestos Hazard Emergency Response Act. That was the original intent, we believe, of where our rules should have pointed to in the first place. And then we've also specified that it should be a minimum of 3 samples for other substances that are not covered by a HERA. And then we've also addressed analysis of wallboard systems. So that's a combination of drywall, joint compound. That's what we refer to as wallboard systems. We've made it clear that those materials, which are layered materials, so you have drywall, joint compounds, tape, all bundled together, those layers must be analyzed separately to determine asbestos content. And the reason for that is that while wallboard almost never has asbestos in it, joint compound does. It often has asbestos content of up to 2%. So some key concerns have been raised by our stakeholders. We did have some concerns on inclusion of asbestos consultants in rule applicability, so that is a category of folks that we are adding to applicability. The concerns there were mostly that they don't have responsibility for the totality of the requirements in the rule, just a portion, but we have limited the applicability section for them in whole or in part. So our intent there is that they're just subject to the provisions of the rule that involve their work. We also had concern that a HERA-trained building inspectors were not allowed to perform surveys at their place of employment. And we, looking at those requirements, thought that didn't really make much sense, and so we've added some rule language to allow that practice. We had a lot of concerns from our utilities that our asbestos notification process was causing delay in restoration of utility services. So we've, I mentioned before, we've done a lot of work to redefine what constitutes an emergency, and we think that we've clarified that at great length, and that's no longer a problem. We do acknowledge that each situation is fact dependent. It's, we think that situations where utility services are disrupted, so water is out, power is out, natural gas is out, that those could constitute an emergency, but perhaps not always. And so we're going to want to see the fact analysis to see if it really is an emergency situation warranting waiver of the notification provisions. We do recognize the need that if this being a fact-specific analysis to provide additional guidance in this area, and so we intend to do that through FAQs. We've also received concerns about our requirement to have a certification piece to the emergency notification letter. And the way we've structured it right now is that both the owner-operator as well as the asbestos consultant needs to certify that emergency notification letter. In the event that the consultant doesn't want to certify, which we've heard from some stakeholders may happen, we've added a provision for notarization. So the notarization provision is not a requirement, it's an option, but we've still heard some concerns from stakeholders that that's an additional burden. A little bit of concern about our not allowing composite analysis for wall systems. So the federal requirements that they also require individual layers be analyzed, but they have an express exemption for wallboard systems when joint compound is only used to cover joint tape and nail holes. We have never interpreted our rule that way. We've always required analysis of individual layers. We acknowledge that our rule has always been more stringent than the NESHAP in that regard. And part of that is that we're not really sure on joint compound whether it has just been used for tape marks or for nail holes. We often see where joint compound is used more akin to skim coats, and so you could have a lot more asbestos involved in that and then folks being exposed. And we also notice that Cal OSHA and federal OSHA require regulations. They don't allow for this practice, so it's not allowed for worker protection. We feel similarly for ambient exposure, we shouldn't allow it here. And then some concerns that by specifying minimum number of samples, that we lead to unnecessary amounts of sampling. Some pushback as to perhaps maybe only one sample is necessary in some of these areas versus the minimum 3 that we specify. We feel fairly comfortable that the minimum 3 is in compliance both with some ASTM building standards and also seems to comport with the AHERA guidelines, so that provides a good confidence level in terms of evaluating asbestos content. And then we have provided a provision to allow for one sample in areas that are very, very small, and so that we feel that that's been a good compromise. So next steps that we have here, we're going to set hearing on December 7th and then plan on having a public hearing for this rule on January 4th. And with that, I'll answer any questions.
Okay. We've been joined by Supervisor Rutherford and Mayor Benoit. Mayor Benoit, would you like to take over chairing the meeting?
Sure, thank you. Thanks for getting us started.
We do have 3 public comments. You want to do those?
All right, let's go ahead and take that.
Okay, so Kurt Coleman, Chris Flake, and then Daniel would give me. So Kurt.
Morning, Kurt Coleman, Southern California Air Quality Alliance. We have some concerns about whether this rule is ready to move forward. As Ms. Rees indicated, there are a number of clarifications that we are awaiting to be made through the frequently asked questions document. And whether we continue to have concerns with the rule as it will be interpreted is largely dependent on being able to review and provide comments and feedback to the staff and see if we can work things out. And so far we haven't seen that, and it's not real clear when we're going to see that. So that's one comment. The other comment is that we have a concern that there seems to be an agreement that a loss of electricity can be considered an emergency that would allow for an emergency notification, but a loss of a natural gas supply perhaps would not. And we think both are essential public services and should be treated the same. I would, as someone who has both gas and electricity at my house, the loss of gas would be considered a big problem. It would be considered a problem at a hospital, for example, if they have boilers that need to provide hot water, steam for sterilization and things like that. So we think there should be an equity issue that needs to be resolved there. Thank you.
Okay, Mr. Chair, we've got Chris Flake.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And Dan there.
Dr. Liu
Yes.
and Mr. Chairman, would you like staff to respond to some of those concerns, or would you prefer
Sure.
to? Thank you. Sarah, do you want to address some of those concerns,
Sure, I'll
particularly
start.
with regards to natural gas? Thank
Yeah,
you.
I'll start on the disruption of natural gas. So there's certainly circumstances where any disruption of utility service we would consider to constitute an emergency. As I mentioned, it is going to be a fact-specific analysis. Certainly, if there's a disruption of natural gas service and it's used to power pumps during a water emergency, or if there, we would probably look at that as constituting an emergency. But we don't have a blanket waiver either for disruption of power or water or natural gas. It's again going to be specific to that particular case and making the case that it fits within the definition of emergency. Oh, and on the FAQs, we don't consider the FAQs to be specific rule requirements, and that's independent of rule language. The FAQs are mostly examples either to continue to educate stakeholders as to basic rule requirements or to provide examples of things like emergency situations where that would qualify for the waiver of notification.
Okay, thanks. Next speaker is Chris.
Thank you. My name is Chris Flake. I'm an engineer at the City of Los Angeles Bureau of Sanitation Regulatory Affairs. I have to note, Doctor, that you and your staff have done a wonderful job trying to bring this up to snuff. And for all the staff here at SCAQMD, it's quite the challenge to bring everything up to snuff because many of these haven't been reviewed for several years. That being the case, however, there are a few things that we really need to look at before we go forward. One of them is when we talk about secure, stabilize, and survey. We need a definition for stabilize, particularly in the case of an emergency. What does stabilize mean to you? Maybe you could offer an answer at this meeting, something that we could agree with or not. But certainly when we're talking about sewers overflowing, breaking the line, whether it's force main or gravity sewer, we mean some serious health problems. Our practice at the city is to stabilize it by not just plugging it, but actually making a patchwork repair that will last for as much as a year or longer so that we can come in later and do a bona fide project to give it a good renovation. And I hope that you can develop some language. I'm sure you can. You're very capable, all of you. The other item I had was, and I want to thank Mr. McClung. Is he in the room? Thank you very much for talking with me this morning. You can tell that I'm very happy with most of what's going on here. It's bringing things up to date, clarifying things, but there's still just a few problems. This other one here, J3, 100 square feet of surface area. I'm not sure that everyone has the same perspective of what that is. So maybe a discussion on that would be helpful. There's also rumors that enforcement doesn't necessarily see all of these rules the same way as you in the rule development area. That's kind of a concern for me. The last item here is the facts, FAQs. It's disheartening to me that you wouldn't have them out by now and that it's rumored to be many pages long. To me, in regulatory affairs, something that long needs to be incorporated more steadfastly in the actual rule. And I'll be sure to help you along steadfastly from here on out. Thank you.
Shelley, would you like to give them staff an offer?
Have any responses for that?
Respond.
Sure. So I'll start on the FAQs. So we are working on them, and again, they are actually many pages long. But part of that is that we've, in this rule development process, been getting a lot of very basic questions on how the rule works, how it is implemented, and so using the FAQs as an opportunity to provide additional education and clarification for folks. We're not putting in rule requirements in the FAQs. It's again just to educate people. We will be getting them out as soon as we can, but we want to make sure that we're vetting them and that they're accurate. And we're also getting additional inquiries as we move along, so it is a growing document. And we intend it to be as a live document. It's not something that we would, you know, kind of lock up and clamp down once the rule is adopted. We would continue to add to them over time and to post them so they're available for folks to review. On emergencies, in a situation where a sewer pipe is broken and you need to go in and to patch it and to stabilize it, like the situation that the gentleman described, I think we would probably consider that to be within an emergency framework. And so you deal with the asbestos abatement required to remedy that situation, to get the utility working again, and that would include the patch that is required. And then you would come in at a later point and do, if there's additional abatement work that's required, go through normal 1403 procedures.
Definition of stabilize and question of enforcement, rule staff, enforcement staff.
Yeah.
Something about the square feet people don't understand.
So yeah, the 100 square feet, 100 square feet is an exemption, or sort of a minimal threshold level for asbestos work. That's something that's been in our rules since initial adoption. And so we consider that to be an appropriate threshold. I think there has been some questions as to how that's applicable to pipe, that might not be a useful metric, and we've looked at ways in which we can kind of help people understand how that applies to pipe.
Okay. Definition of stabilize?
And stabilize, again, you know, to the, on the emergency notification, I think we would consider, you know, the situation that the gentleman described as going in and having to patch that pipe, that would be stabilization in our mind and needed to, you know, fall within the situation of the emergency.
Common understanding between rulemaking staff and enforcement staff?
Rulemaking staff and enforcement staff have been working very closely together on the development of this rule.
Great. I think you covered them all. Dan, we've got you, and then John, is it Sanks? Yeah, and then Cindy Parsons.
Dan McGivney with SoCalGas. I guess we're still concerned on the number of issues that are unresolved. I know that we've got the FAQ document, and that's not really rulemaking in officially in the sense from the district's perspective. From my perspective, I think it depends, right? I mean, when the rulemaking document, and at the last we've heard, it's approaching 40 pages. That's an enormous sized FAQ document. A lot of the industry's been informed that there's a lot of issues been brought up that or interpretations asked for that are being addressed in this FAQ document. So to not see it until possibly as late as after the rule's adopted is a little late. So I think a document that large should be part of the rulemaking. It's being developed during and because of the rulemaking. It should be released in advance of any hearings and given the industry and the public time to review and respond to that comment on it. On the exemption or for essential services, again, gas company there was statements made that the gas utilities were not going to be covered under that. Sarah's saying that they are, so I guess we'll take that for her word. But I mean, the issue is that we do support a lot of essential services. There were some mentioned, but flood control, fire flow, public water supply, gas for boilers, emergency generators at hospitals and things. So it is essential, and we do need to be able to respond to emergency outages, you know, and breaks in lines and whatever right away. On the stabilization issue, there's a lot of language that are still in there where there's reporting or notifications required when there's this emergency event. So we may have to stabilize whatever again that means. To say we can fix it or patch it, those are you know, kind of relative broad terms. You know, we need to be able to go in and maybe dig up and replace pieces of pipe or whatever. So you know, I think there needs to be a little bit more detail, and again, that's detail we would like before the rule goes to the board. State again, you know, and we need to restore service for whatever. I can remember a fire up in Big Bear several years ago where the electricity was shut down again because of added fire danger. The only available fire flow on the ground was from gas, you know, natural gas fired pumps. Okay, if we're out and we have to call in and wait for an authorization to then restore that service, that's a problem. So we again request that that we can not only just stabilize, but repair and restore the service to the outage area. We ask that the rule be deferred until, set board hearing
I
until.
don't think the buzzer stops until you do.
Okay. And we request that we have more time to work with staff to alleviate these issues. So we're requesting that the set board hearing be deferred until February, mostly because the next month is a lot of
You got
holidays.
your request. Everyone's got to stay within the time limits, Dan. Thank you. John, and then Cindy.
Hello, my name is John Sanks, and I'm with Anaheim Public Utilities, and broadly I'd say I concur with the comments that I've heard from the other utilities related to this. I don't need a response on mine today, but I will say we've submitted a pretty lengthy comment letter related to the October 31st work group, and we would request that the hearing be deferred until we've received, until our comments have been addressed. As for the FAQ, I agree with the others where I think it shows some essentially a legislative intent, not that this is a legislative body, and it is difficult to provide relevant comments when we don't necessarily know what are the thoughts of staff as they put the rule together. So, thank you.
Thank you. Cindy.
Hi, I'm Cindy Parsons with Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. So we've been an active participant in this whole proceeding, and coming into this, one of our biggest issues, which is still questionable as far as whether it's been resolved, is our ability to deal with an emergency, which includes cleanup of an asbestos-containing material spill. So that's something that the existing practices was that we would have to file paperwork, wait for AQMD to review it and approve it before we were allowed to do the work. So in the event of an emergency, that can result in up to a 24-hour delay in us being able to deal with the emergency. And so we appreciate that staff is working with us as far as being able to address the emergency. And so that's great. But there's an extra part to that. There's the next step. And so in the event it's a water pipe in the street or a gas pipe in the street, you've got a hole where you've been working. And so you're able to go in and fix the pipe and restore the service, but you need to fill in the hole, patch the street, reopen the street, so to minimize the impact to the public. So that's one thing that we still hope to be able to resolve. And so we do agree with deferring the taking this forward to the board for approval, just because there are still some unanswered questions having to do with the utility services and our ability to be able to deal with these emergencies. And that also includes a spill. In the case of insulation off of a steam pipe that fell off due to a rainstorm. It's laying on the ground, it's drying out, the wind is blowing it, and that really is an emergency. But up until now, we've had to just barricade it off, let it sit there, and file the paperwork and wait for AQMD to approve it. And so we really need streamlining on that, and so the proposal was a pre-approved plan, be able to do a verbal notification. We have all of our own in-house asbestos people that are trained because we have to deal with this on a regular basis. So, so there really needs to be more of a streamlined process that doesn't involve AQMD getting in the way of utilities doing what they need to do. And then, same question about stabilization. Does that allow us to complete the job and reopen the street? Or do we have to leave the hole in the ground? FAQs, our experience with other rules is that there's a lot of interpretation in the FAQs. And so we really do want to be able to see what that is and comment on it. So,
All right.
thank you very much.
Thank you, Cindy. That's all the public comment here.
All right, board member comments? None?
Well, I'd like to see us resolve
Well-
these outstanding issues. Be nice if we could do that.
I would too, and when I hear about the FAQ, I think back to when you have a general public trying to understand this rule too. The FAQs are critical to get out at least at the same time. But I guess my other big concern here is when I look at this rule, I'll tell you, as a city, when something happens out in the field and we have someone that's got a house that needs to be demolished or whatever, and we have to do an asbestos test first, and my building officials are highly involved in this, and I haven't heard from any building officials from any of the cities. Are we changing any of the rules that would affect cities' operations as far as building officials, and or is this just for big asbestos issues? I'm hearing from utilities, but won't this also affect the person remodeling their home or doing any work at their house?
Yeah, so this rule, there is an exemption for homeowners who are doing the work themselves. So they own their own home, they're doing their work themselves, they're not hiring anybody else. They are actually exempt from the requirements of this rule. But it applies to everybody else who's doing asbestos work.
When you say doing asbestos work, so if anyone that's remodeling a kitchen, are they required to go out, and if they hired a contractor, the contractor should be going and getting an asbestos check before they work on the kitchen?
If you're hiring a contractor to demolish or renovate your kitchen, you need that contractor needs to be getting a survey so that they can confirm or evaluate whether there's asbestos work and that it would be subject to the requirements of the regulation.
And that hasn't changed. That's the current rule is the same?
That's the current rule, right.
Okay. Is there anything that's changing from the current rule to the new rule that would affect that, or as far as a small homeowner or a small contractor that's supposed to be going through and getting those type of permits?
But those are all basic requirements of the rule that have been in existence since rule adoption.
And they're going to stay in.
And they'll stay in.
Okay. I can tell you when I did my kitchen remodel with my contractor, no one checked. So and I know my city did not require the contractor to go out and get that check before, and I know the cities around me are not checking too. So I'm curious to find out. There seems to be maybe some communication we need to make out to these cities to let them know that, hey, if it's anything over 100 square feet, you're supposed to be getting the survey done first. So.
That's one of the things we've discovered going through this process is that there's a lot of misunderstanding about the rule requirements, as well as where asbestos materials can be found and the risks of exposure. And so we do recognize the need to do additional outreach in this area.
Okay, and on those, that 100 square foot and the owner requirement, is that lined up with the federal, or is that stricter than the federal standard on that?
That's slightly more, our 100 square foot exemption is slightly more stringent than the federal standard, but that's been in our rules for as long as I've been able to see it.
What is the federal standard on that?
I believe it's 160. Yeah, 160.
Okay. It's not a huge difference.
No.
Okay, I guess that's where my big concerns are, is how this is going to affect our local municipalities as we move forward with permitting for basic remodels, and if we're not changing a lot of that, it's just that we need to educate that these have been in effect and no one's been following them. That's a different story, but those are my big concerns, and also with the FAQ. So I'll rest on the rest of my colleagues. Do we feel like this is ready to move forward, or do we want to wait until we see the FAQ? Janice, do you have any questions, or Supervisor?
We're not hearing you.
Janice, we can't hear you.
We're not hearing you, Supervisor.
Nope.
No. Is the light green on that little guy? It's
No
green.
sign
We're not hearing
language.
it.
I don't have any questions if you're asking me, Mr. Chair. This is Supervisor Perez.
Thank you, Supervisor Perez.
I would guess the question is, does staff feel that they can resolve these issues in time before it comes to the board, and you don't have a whole lot of time to do it with a holiday week coming up? And I know that we're under intense pressure to keep getting these rules done. We have a lot of them, and this one, by and large, I think everyone agrees that we're all on board. We want to minimize the public health dangers from asbestos exposure, and we want to get it right. But the comments kind of suggest that we're not quite there yet.
Yeah, and we have been doing a lot of work with stakeholders and we'll continue to do that. I think we are actually a lot closer than what comments would indicate in terms of a understanding of, what constitutes an emergency and what the duration of the emergency is, such that the work can be done to restore services and keeping a big hole open in a public roadway is not something.
Coming
we
up in
consider.
December.
This is coming up in December, correct?
So I think,
For set
hearing.
Yes.
Okay, so that gives us a little bit of
So I
time.
think we do have some time to continue working with stakeholders on this.
Okay, so I would suggest we stay on the same schedule, but that if there continues to be outstanding issues, that we consider delaying it.
Does staff feel we'll have any part of the FAQ ready to go to at least look at when we get to rulemaking, or will that be available at all?
We can have some parts available. I mean, we're still reviewing them, and as I mentioned, as we continue to get questions, we're adding to that because we see that really as an educational document and a growing document, but we will be able to provide a copy of what we have.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman?
Yep.
So I'd just like to add, as was said earlier, we would like to keep this on schedule, at least to do set hearing in December. And so with that, you'll have our commitment to continue to work forward to try to advance the FAQs as aggressively as possible. As Sarah said, we believe that we've addressed a lot of these issues. A letter will be going out from me today to the gas company, addressing a lot of their concerns. I think we've expressed our thoughts with regards to a lot of these issues, but you'd have my commitment that come December, if we don't think that we're ready, instead of going for a 30-day set hearing, we may go for a 60-day. But let's keep it on track and we'll keep you apprised of where we are.
Mr. Chair?
Go ahead.
This Supervisor Solis, I concur. I think let's keep moving, but if we do find that there's more discussion and we don't have clarity, then I would move to recommend that we push this off for another 60 days. If we find in December we don't have some of these answers to these questions that have been posed.
Yep, I would agree. Okay, and I think we're okay with Supervisor Rutherford too. I don't know if she can maybe do a hand signal, but I think we're okay there as well.
Thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs up.
All right. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the next item then.
And Mr. Chair,
proposed
Michael
rule.
Kraus isn't here, so Phil Fine is supposed to take this one, I think.
Mike's here, but Phil
Mike is
wanted
here.
to take this presentation.
Oh, okay.
All right, go ahead.
There it is. Susan's gonna be doing it.
No,
Susan's gonna
Phil,
do it?
Phil.
Phil's gonna be doing it.
Phil's gonna be doing it remotely.
He's got the hot potato.
Go, Phil, go. But if it doesn't work, then I'll do it.
Well, I don't think
We're
he
gonna try to.
can he hear us?
Phil, can you hear us?
I'll get the
Yeah, so just because it's a little difficult to do from here, I'll defer to Susan. Susan can present.
You got it, Susan.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to give you an overview of the AB 617 BART implementation schedule. All the air districts that are in non-attainment are required to provide a schedule of the expedited implementation of best available retrofit control technology on or before January 1, 2019. So we're providing sort of a preview of some of the upcoming BART rules that will satisfy this requirement, and also we're giving you an update of where we are in terms of our thinking in regards to the other elements that we're required to report on. One being cost effectiveness, the second being public health and clean air benefits, and the third being air quality and attainment. So this gives you a little bit of a preview of what you're going to see in the December rule forecast report for some of our upcoming rules that we're planning on bringing forward in the time frame. It's a lot of NOx rules in regards to what we're planning on doing. It also includes some PM rules and then also one VOC rule. In terms of the air quality benefit, as we go through the rulemaking and we do our BART technology assessment, that will establish the NOx emission limit that we're going to set. At that time, we'll be able to have a better idea of what the air quality benefit is. But since we're very close to Rule 1146 in terms of it coming to a public hearing, the estimated emission reductions are 0.27 tons per day. And then 1118.1, which is scheduled for a January public hearing, the estimated emission reductions are 0.2. We did adopt Rule 1135 and amendments to 1135, which in the last, was it November public hearing, although that is not identified as an industrial source, it's an example of our approach to the BART implementation, that we're looking at not just those that are defined as an industrial source or greenhouse gas cap and trade facilities, but we're looking at reclaim and non-reclaim facilities and a more expansive and extensive look on the technology assessment for BART. As we move through in these rulemakings, we are doing a cost effectiveness analysis that is required under the Health and Safety Code. And it goes hand in hand with the BART assessment. And so we look at, it's a dollar of the cost of pollution controls, which includes the capital costs, operating maintenance, permitting, ongoing costs such as source testing, monitoring that are embodied in the cost. And then on the denominator is the emission reductions, tons of pollutants reduced associated with implementing that particular pollution control for that particular control measure. The 2016 AQMP established a cost effectiveness threshold of $50,000 per ton of NOx reduced. We've been kind of using that as a general benchmark for us as we're moving forward in our BART rules for NOx to look to see whether or not something looks like it is or isn't cost effective. In regards to public health and clean air benefits, at this time we don't have specific numbers and estimates on this, but this is something as we move forward and we'll be able to quantify, especially as we update our air quality management plan and we look at the ozone benefits, PM 2.5, PM 10, and NO2. But as we implement these NOx rules, we'll also see benefits in the precursors for those pollutants, and we'll be able to quantify that as we move along. In terms of air quality attainment, there are a number of NOx rules that we're currently working on, and in addition for PM 2.5, there's 10 stationary source control measures. All of these are part of the 2016 Air Quality Management Plan Control Strategy and was modeled in there. So we know that implementation as we move forward and we get these reductions, that it'll help us towards moving towards attainment for ozone and PM 2.5. So next step is what you'll see in the in the rule forecast report for 2019. It'll be presented in the December 2018 board meeting. We'll have all of the rules that we are planning for the year of 2019. And then it'll also have an element for the AB 617 that will talk about the implementation and the rules that are specific to AB 617. Any questions, comments?
Any public comments on this? Any comments from the board members?
Yeah, Mr. Chair, if I may, I just want to confirm that with this schedule, that all of the facilities that are covered by AB 617 will have gotten to our compliance by the deadline of December 31st, 2023.
I think for one.
Dr. Liu, this is Phil. That is the goal. Obviously, it does take time to implement controls. Our number one goal is to capture the lion's share of the emission reductions achievable through BART implementation by that deadline at the end of 2023. But it might not be possible to get every bit of control on just through logistical constraints at facilities or even the availability of builders and contractors and purveyors of the control equipment. So we have to consider all those factors, but that is our goal, the end of 2023. And we will be focusing on, as we have been, on the largest sources so we can get the lion's share of the reductions by that time. If it is not feasible by 2023, then it's not feasible under BART by 2023. So that feasibility is one of the BART considerations along with cost effectiveness.
Okay, thank you for that answer.
Any other questions from my board members? right, very good. Thank you. The next item, proposed Rule 1325 for the federal PM 2.5. Is Michael here? There he is.
Yes, I am. Good morning.
Go right ahead.
Okay, gotta get the presentation up here. Here we go. Yes, I'm here to discuss some proposed amendments we're making to Rule 1325. As a reminder, this is the NSR for the federal NSR for PM 2.5 applicable to major sources. Back in 2016, we did amend this particular rule at the time when we were reclassifying our region this is for the 2006 24-hour PM 2.5 from a moderate to a serious non-attainment standard or attainment status. And in doing so means that we redefine what would be considered a major polluting facility. As a moderate non-attainment area, a major polluting facility is one that's defined at 100 tons per year of PM 2.5 and its precursors. This would then drop down, sort of like a quote-unquote punishment, as you're looking at a higher non-attainment status. It then drops down to 70. So we wanted to make sure that was defined in the rule, which we did. We specifically identified, in addition, as VOCs and ammonia as precursors. However, EPA came out and identified a slight deficiency. They believed that that we should also make a reference to those precursors, those PM 2.5 precursors, in another definition. So we did define it under our precursor definition, but we didn't define it under our regulated NSR pollutant. So it's an oversight on that. So basically, we're just doing an administrative correction on that. In addition, we thought while we're in the rule, to clarify some language, remove some outdated dates that are in the rule as well. So basically, we've released that language out to the public. We did have a public workshop on that and a few attendees on that. We are setting this in December for a January public hearing. And this is actually in the Federal Register currently, so we just want to make sure that EPA does approve this rule, and this is the only thing that's sort of holding that up. So if you have any questions, it's pretty straightforward, I think.
Any comment on this or public comment? Any board member questions or comments? All right. Thank you, Michael. All right. Our next item is the reclaim quarterly report. And Susan, this you actually have time to hear.
It's Friday. So I'm gonna give you the overview of the Reclaim Quarterly Update. So we've been having this kind of at a glance, and we were just talking today that I think we're gonna start to add on here the rules that we've adopted and the tonnage that we're getting from those rules as we move along. So, but this gives you the update in regards to where we are in terms of the overall Reclaim implementation, in terms of the transition. As we look at the Reclaim Working Group meetings over the past quarterly update, we've had meetings July, September, and November. The most recent meeting that we had, we focused a lot on the new source review. We broke it down into 3 main issues, and focusing on the first issue that we wanted to discuss with the working group in terms of staff's opinion and go over staff's thinking in regards to that particular issue, which is the offsetting obligations as facilities transition out of Reclaim as it relates to new source review. This is going to be a little bit of a tag team with Barbara Baird, and she's going to talk about the BARC requirements for retrofit and replacement. Just as a segue to this is a comment that has been raised through a number of the BARC rules as we're moving forward in the rulemaking process, and it's been fairly lengthy comment letters that we received on this issue of the definition of BARC and whether it could be a replacement could be included as part of the definition and requirement for BARC.
Thank you, Susan. For context and update, we had received, or the governing board members had received comment letters on November 1st when we set hearing on the Rule 1146 series. And in that comment letter, there was an attachment that was a new 3rd letter from weve and Watkins regarding their position that the AQMD cannot require replacement as BARC. So we'll be responding to that in the board package for the Rule 1146 that you'll get for the December board meeting. But just to recap our position, the statutory definition of bark, in our view, does not exclude equipment replacement. There are applicable dictionary definitions that refer to retrofit as it can mean a replacing equipment or system. We think policy reasons support our interpretation because otherwise it may be that the oldest and dirtiest equipment escapes control entirely. And then finally, even if the commenter is correct on the definition of bark, we don't think bark is a limitation on the AQMD's authority. Bark was specifically imposed on us as a requirement, a minimum mandate years ago. But pre-existing, we had authority to regulate emissions from stationary sources that would allow us to require equipment replacement, and we do have done that, such as in our rule for dry cleaners and some of the provisions of some of our other earlier NOx rules. So, and I should just mention that although the comment letter was filed in 1146 rulemaking, this issue I don't think is raised by 1146. There's nothing in 1146 rules that requires equipment replacement. So it's just an ongoing battle that at some point maybe there will be something real that's at stake, but so far there is not. Happy to answer any questions on my part.
Yeah, great.
All right, any public comment on this?
Yeah, we're gonna, there's a little more. So,
Gotcha.
one of the items that was discussed when we, I think it was at the October board meeting, or it was the November board meeting, I'm not sure, but was that staff to have a commitment in regards to presenting on a monthly basis to stationary source committee NSR issues. So as we do these quarterly updates, we'll give a more in-depth discussion, and then our recommendation, which is in a later slide, is that we provide a written report in regards to the where we are on the resolving the NSR issues and our work with EPA and the other stakeholders. So wanted to give a little more context to the Stationary Source Committee in regards to what the three main issues are. The first issue is what is the obligation as facilities transition out of reclaim if they had an NSR event in that they had to provide RTCs for a new or modified piece of equipment, and as they transition out of reclaim, what is their obligation for future offsetting requirements? That's the first issue. The second issue as it relates to new source review is if a facility doesn't have a permit to emit, how do you establish that baseline as they transition out of reclaim and address whether or not after they transition out of reclaim, if there's a new source review event, and they would need to provide offsets. And then the third issue is ensuring that there's sufficient offsets as facilities transition out of reclaim. That's been probably our main concern is what is going to be that supply of offsets in the future to ensure that facilities can modernize and to replace, and we're not stifling growth in the basin. So those are the three main issues that we're working on, and there's many sub issues within there, but this embodies the main three issues that we've been trying to work on with EPA. So in terms of our update, we have been working with EPA on all three issues, and so we want to have a face-to-face meeting, and we're looking probably at the end of this month or the beginning of December to meet with EPA. We have been having ongoing phone calls with them in regards to these different topics, but we want to have a more specific discussion on those three topics, and hopefully we can come to some resolution. We feel that the boundaries and the guiding elements are what is in the Clean Air Act under Section 110L and under SB 288. So the Clean Air Act has prohibitions for backsliding, and SB 288 has specific requirements that you cannot have a program under new source review that's less stringent than what was adopted, I think, in 2000. So we feel that those are the two main elements that we need to demonstrate as we move forward And so we'll continue to work with EPA and all the stakeholders on this. So as we move forward, we'll continue to work with EPA, we'll work with the working group. Our recommendation is that we provide quarterly detailed updates like we did today to the stationary committee as we do the reclaim quarterly update. And then we just provide a monthly report to the stationary to give you a summary of where we are in the process. Just an update on the BART command and control rules. Many working group meetings have been occurring over the past quarter, working on a number of rules. 1146 is scheduled for hearing in December, and then we have other rules, 1118.1, which is scheduled for not December, it's now scheduled for January. 1134, we're probably looking at April. 1135 was just amended in November. Other rules that are coming up, you'll see in 2019 is 1109.1, 1110.2, and then we added another rule on here, which is for monitoring, reporting, and record keeping, which will be proposed rule 113. So just looking forward, next steps, we continue to have our monthly meetings with the Reclaim Working Group, continue our rulemaking activities, and the work on resource review. Any questions, comments?
Do you have any public comments on this?
We have one card, Mike Carroll.
All right, go right ahead.
Good morning, Mike Carroll with Latham & Watkins on behalf of WISPA and the Regulatory Flexibility Group. I want to first acknowledge that I know we did inundate board members and staff with some significant number of comments prior to the last board meeting. Hopefully, if you've had a chance to look at that, you realize that we were really just making some global points for the record, and we weren't asking for anything specific with respect to either Rule 1135 or 1146. Had we been asking you to do something specific, we obviously would have gotten that into you sooner. But we thought it was important, as these were the first landing rules, to come before the board, even though they're not the rules that most directly affect the facilities in our organizations, that we put some of our global concerns on the record. So that was the reason for that. The one issue that I wanted to address today was we did ask staff in the week leading up to the set hearing to bifurcate Rule 1100, proposed Rule 1100 from the 1146 series. That rule has kind of been piggybacked on the 1146 series rules, but it includes some issues that extend well beyond those two rules and will be generally applicable to all of the landing rules. And they're important issues in the transition of reclaim. Specifically, we raised in our comment letter concerns about a provision that's currently in that rule related to retaining reclaim MR&R. That's an issue that we addressed very early on in the transition process, expressing our hope and our view that it was appropriate to modify some of the more onerous provisions of the reclaim MR&R as we transition to command and control. We've also had discussions going back to very early in the transition process about the need for some sort of a provision that would provide flexibility for facilities that find themselves facing multiple landing rules with potentially conflicting implementation schedules. And we think 1100 is the appropriate place for that provision to reside, but there hasn't been anything developed and there's nothing in that rule. So we asked that 1100 be bifurcated from the 1146 series, sent back to the working group to look at those issues and perhaps others that working group members may have. Staff was not inclined to do that. I suspect that they haven't changed their position since then, and I also suspect that the committee, having set the rule for hearing, is not inclined to, at this point, bifurcate it from the 1146 series and put it off. But what I would ask is perhaps for some direction from the committee and a commitment from staff to work on those issues in the near term, meaning the next couple of months. Rule 1100 is identified on the rulemaking calendar for most of the upcoming board hearings, and if we can get a commitment to work on those in the next couple of months and then bring it back to the board, that would be appreciated. Thank you.
Anyone else?
Does staff have a response for that real quick?
So Rule 1100, the purpose of it is to establish the implementation schedule for the reclaim facilities. the rule 1146, 1146.1, 1146.2, they're existing rules that apply to the non-reclaim. And so we thought it'd be too confusing to have a schedule for their compliance dates have passed, and then in putting these new reclaim compliance dates in there. So that's what 1100 is. In regards to monitoring, record keeping, reporting, we have Rule 113, which I had listed in the quarterly update. That is scheduled for 2019. That will have the monitoring, record keeping, reporting requirements, and will address those requirements there. We do agree that there are certain requirements in the MRRs that we can modify now that we're moving from a mass emissions-based program to one that's going to be focused on concentration. So we'll be looking at that in Rule 113. And then in regards to the comment that looking at facilities that have multiple pieces of equipment, 1146 has a pretty extensive discussion and analysis that looked at all the facilities and all their other pieces of equipment and the other landing rules that are coming down, and coordinating the implementation schedule and looking at how many pieces of equipment, the size of equipment, and what they potentially would need to do. And because 1146 is going to be one of the first landing rules out of the gate, we feel the facilities have the sufficient time, even though they're going to have other equipment they're going to need to retrofit to meet the requirements of future rules, and that the time frame is sufficient. So that's analyzed, it's embodied in the 1146 staff report, the discussions there, it's pretty robust. We discussed it at multiple working group meetings as well as the reclaim working group.
All right, any other board member questions? Oh, I'm sorry, do we have more public comment?
No, not here in CCA.
Okay. Staff, do you have another response or more response?
This is Phil. So I think Susan touched on it. The whole reason for this Rule 1100 is to provide flexibility and implementation schedule for facilities that have equipment that are going to cross several of these landing rules. If we did not have something like 1100 going every time we do a landing rule, then every facility would be subject to the same schedule regardless of how much other equipment they have. So the point behind 1100 in the first place is to provide a little more customizable implementation schedule, recognizing that some facilities have equipment that will cross 2 or 3 or more of these landing rules that will be coming forward at different times. So that was the point of 1100 in the first place.
All right, any board member questions?
Mr. Chair, just one quick one. I'm assuming that the upcoming meeting with EPA, you're hoping to get some very specific feedback on this so that we have a much better idea of whether or not we're putting together something they can approve.
Right. Yeah, we need a lot. It'll take
Well, Dr. Liu, this is Phil. Yeah, we're very hopeful that, we've had half a dozen or more conference calls, but we think a half-day or full-day face-to-face meeting, we're hopeful that could resolve the remaining issues, and we want to get that done as soon as possible.
Sounds like a good idea.
Very good. Any other board member comments or questions? Not seeing any. We'll go to the next item are the 2 written reports. Any questions or comments on those? Any other business for the board? Any general public comment?
None here.
All right. All right, with that, we'll adjourn this to the next meeting, December 19th. Do we have a firm time on the next meeting? Has that been set now for Station Resource National Point? I know we were talking about that.
10:30?
Yes, sir. December 19th, 10:30.
Okay. Very good. We'll see you all next month. Have a good Thanksgiving, everyone.